Pamela, thanks for coming on. I just want to say hello to you and let you give us the story about how you came to be where you're at, because you have a very rich history and you've been doing a lot of stuff in very diverse fields. So maybe you could give us some background on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Demetrius, and thank you for having me on this discussion of what I think is a timely topic in machine learning and artificial intelligence. My background, I started my career as a software developer, working for financial services firms in the areas of trading systems and risk applications. So I designed and developed, and I lead, I now, as a technology manager, lead teams of developers and analysts and QA teams in the design and development of quantitative market risk applications, quantitative pricing algorithms, and trading systems. I often had friends and family who would ask me questions like, we know that you do all of these fancy things for Wall Street firms, but are you really happy? And do you have meaning in your life in that regard? And so, whilst I was happy with what I do for a living, I always found it, found opportunities outside of what I did to also find ways of giving back to the community and being in touch with more of the humanities side of things. I became a pilot in 2006 and developed a community-based organization that exposes careers in aviation to young people. Nice. And so I've been just continuously chugging along through my career, doing trading technology, working in it also in an area called model risk management. In 2001, bank regulations created a regulation around model risk management. And when 2020 hit, of course, that made changes for everybody, and including myself. I started to notice that there is this entire new body of industry called AI ethics. And when I looked under the hood of AI ethics, I realized, well, gee, I have, many of the types of experiences that would lend itself to supporting this community. Having been a developer, having been working in creating quantitative algorithmic types of mathematical based applications on Wall Street in risk management, credit risk, market risk, trading, and including model risk. So in 2020, I decided to switch gears and to focus on this industry of AI ethics. I created a framework for AI ethics called FAIR, Framework for AI Risk, and it is based on that regulation that is defined for banking regulations around model risk, which is the Federal Reserve Board's SR 11-7. And so that's how I got into this industry.
Excellent. And I know that when we talked before, we said, okay, we really want to look at how we can balance the whole idea of ethics and not like slowing us down. This idea of ethics being something that it's going to slow us down, it's going to kill our innovation time, right? And so how can we look at both of these, and perhaps agile methods are a great way to implement just keep it fast tracked. And I know that when we talked before, you were like, wow, I really wish I could come to the meetup with the defined framework and, hey, this is how it is. This is the best part of it. This is what we need to do. We've seen people utilizing it like this and like that. But the truth of the matter is that it's a little bit too early for that, I think. And so that's why we wanted to have this conversation. And I told you, I know that it's much better that you come to us right now in this meetup with questions and ideas, and we have a conversation about it, and everyone in the meetup can also have a conversation. And if you're listening in the future, you can let us know in the comments, because what we want to do is create this conversation around it and hopefully build that framework together. And maybe in 2 months you come back on the meetup and you can give us the framework that has been fleshed out and it's been tested by 1 or 2 teams. So now let's just get into it. I think the main thing that we should probably start with is the idea of Agile AI or Agile Machine Learning, and if those things, if they're the right fit for each other.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And you bring up a good point. So, as I mentioned, with the proliferation of artificial intelligence in the last few years, based on the development of enabler algorithms and enabler hardware, AI ethics has become much more prominent, especially last year. But one of the types of feedback that I've heard in some different forums and in different conversations is that a concern. I don't know that it necessarily is a reality, but a concern as to whether or not AI ethics will dampen innovation in AI. And so there's this need to, obviously there is a need for AI ethics, and I'm an AI ethicist, so I promote and advocate for AI ethics. But having been a technology leader and a scrum master for 30 years, I also understand the issues and the concerns of technology teams. So I do think it's important that we come to start to ask better questions around this and find out what are the types of solutions. From the research that I've been doing in the past month or so in looking at this topic, I found that surprisingly, there are very many, and I almost would say most, if not many, AI teams are using agile principles. But when we look at that, we first have to understand, well, what is agile? So agile is not necessarily in and of itself a hard-coded framework. There are frameworks, obviously, around agile, Scrum, Kanban, and several others. But Agile itself, based on the 2001 Manifesto of Agile, is simply a set of values and principles. And teams that make decisions around these values and principles can therefore call themselves Agile. So some of those Agile principles are placing individual contributions above, long drawn out documentation and requirements, having workable software as a higher value versus detailed contract negotiations. So Agile is obviously a set of principles, and as long as an AI team adopts those principles, whether or not they are using, full on Scrum or hybrid Scrum or something in between, still will enable them to call themselves Agile. So I want to make that point up front, and that it's probably, like everything, an evolutionary process. We're in the beginning stages, really still, of AI. AI is not as ubiquitous as it will be in 10 or 20 years, but we're on the revolutionary explosion of that. AI ethics is still relatively new, and so these tools, these frameworks are evolving.
Yeah, you make a great point with that. And what I think was something that took me a minute to wrap my head around was the idea of agile, and not just agile using it for ML, which I think we're all very clear with. And there's a lot of people in the community that are struggling with whether or not it's the best route to take, and whether or not we should be doing 2-week sprints for machine learning, because there's so many X factors that come into play. But then taking it to, it's not only, what you're proposing is not only like, okay, let's do agile with machine learning, let's do agile with the underlying ethics that are involved in the ways that you're creating this machine learning. Is that correct?
That's correct. So what I'm suggesting is that ethics become baked in almost to everything, to the mindset of a machine learning engineer and of a data scientist and of the machine learning operational processes, or MLOps. And Agile can be a way, there are many ways of using Agile or leveraging Agile to do that. In terms of 2-week sprints, so what I've seen in the literature right now is, again, while there are no set standards, there are some practices that I'm seeing repeating. For instance, there's this concept that I've identified as inter versus intra. So intra means obviously within a process, and inter means between several processes. So the MLOps life cycle, as you know, and you would know better than myself, involves at a high level, defining your problem set, identifying, acquiring, cleaning, labeling, annotating your data, engineering your features and designing your model, training your model, testing or training your algorithm, testing your model output, and then ultimately getting some level of approval and deployment. So if we looked at each of those as major phases of the machine learning process, each of those phases in and of themselves, contained within themselves, if you will, could adapt agile processes within them, or intra. So within the design process, what I've seen is that there's a need for leveraging user stories. If we adapted one of the concepts from Agile, we would use some form of documentation to document our design, to document our data definitions, etc. In doing so, those user stories, if we use typical user story nomenclature, a user story reads something like, as a role, I want to do X so that I can accomplish Y goal. And there's an acceptance criteria on that user story. Well, what I'm proposing is that in addition to acceptance criteria, in terms of whether or not it meets certain performance measurements, we add an ethical acceptance criteria. So right at the level of defining atomic individual user stories, we're baking in not only Agile, but we're baking in ethics, ethical questions that are very specific to that user story. So it ensures that we don't forget it, so that it also ensures that our ethical analysis wasn't too high level. For instance, the FAIR framework that I recommend is based on SR 11.7, or model risk management. Model risk management includes many model hygiene practices, if you will, that occur oftentimes prior to the point where you're actually defining the model. It involves identifying your risks at a high level. It involves tiering your models. So if you have an entire inventory of models already developed, you will, or in the planning phases, you will tier them to best determine the types of activities you want to perform on them going forward. The mindset there is that not all models are created equal. Yeah. And just because you have 10 models, that doesn't mean all of them, as an example, are candidates for explainable AI, or model cards or data sheets. Some model implementations are leverage other models. There's the concept of nested models, or models within a models that are called by other models. So tiering your models is an exercise in our framework that occurs outside of the scoping, user story, data construct process. It's higher up in the life cycle process. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, and
But that's an example. User stories would be a concrete example of design documentation that has ethics baked into it.
Yeah, I think I would love if we could even go maybe a step further and talk about like the user story and how you see that playing out in a specific use case, and how it would be, how ethics would be involved there, because you kind of touched on it. Hey, well, not all models are created equal. So how would ethics be in an agile way put into practice in your mind?
Right. Okay. So if there's a use case or a user story that says we're looking to predict a certain outcome, and we have a set of dependent and independent variables, the user story might define creating this outcome at a high level. On the part of that user story, we might have an ethical acceptance criteria that says it's important to make sure that if that the outcome does not impinge upon data privacy rules or data privacy of an individual, should that user story leverage a person's personal data at an individual level. So now we have an ethical principle aligned to a specific user story outcome, so that every instantiation and every use of that user story throughout the machine learning pipeline will have that ethical edict, if you will, that requires developers, engineers, data scientists to keep that edict in mind. That would be a very high level example. That would be a very high level example.
So what I would love to hear if anyone here with us right now is doing any kind of ethics within their machine learning program, or if they're practicing machine learning engineers, and you bring ethics onto the table, because that's something that I know a lot of people call for, is the gap to be bridged. And it feels like you have the people that are creating the models over here, and then the people that are the ethics people that are over here, and they're not on the same team. And maybe, like you said, there's this fear that the people who are creating the models think like, oh, the ethics team is going to hear about this and they're never going to let that fly, or, oh, they're going to slow us down by weeks and we're never going to get anything out. Or even like what we can talk about in a bit is the idea of being done in the agile sense and how that looks. And so what I am... oh, I see somebody's thrown in the chat right now. A great book to read is Weapons of Math Destruction.
Yeah,
all right, that is a great one. Cool. So anyone who wants to check that out, definitely do. But the idea that I was trying to say is that this, basically what you're proposing, I really like, because you are saying the people that are building the models should also have some kind of criteria to make sure that you're following some kind of ethical standards while you're making the model. Is that how I'm understanding it?
Yeah, so AI ethics involves many different tenets and many different principles and many different activities. So auditing your algorithms is a feature of AI ethics. Model tiers itself is a feature of AI ethics. Model validation control is a feature of AI ethics. Explainable AI versus interpretable AI, and those types of decisions that a data scientist would make are ways of incorporating AI ethics. Not all, from what I've seen, and again, we're still nascent in this space, not all AI ethical tools, techniques, processes, et cetera, are themselves, quote unquote, agile, but they are processes that can be embedded within an agile mindset, framework, et cetera. So another example that I've seen and learned about is this concept in agile, in typical traditional software development. Agile lends itself to creating what's called minimally viable products. The waterfall method or approach to creating a product is in phase one. If you're creating a car, phase one, you create a wheel. Phase two, you create two wheels. For phase three, you create the chassis. For phase four, you create the body. And phase five, you have a car. So you don't have anything that's workable until phase five, and that's waterfall. But in agile, phase one or sprint one, you have a skateboard. Sprint two, you have a scooter skater.
Yeah.
Is that a word? I make up my own words. In
right.
phase three, you have a bike. In phase four, you have a motorbike. Phase five, you have a car. So at each phase of this, you have a minimally working product. So what I've heard of by and read about and talked to some artificial intelligence practitioners is that this concept of minimally viable data or minimally viable models. So MVMs or MVDs. And MVDs, an example of that would be, let's say I had a use case where I wanted to design and do some sort of an inference off of all of the fruits of the world. I want to categorize, catalog, and do some sort of business intelligence off of all of the fruits of the world. So in Waterfall, I would first identify all of the fruits of the world, categorize them, list them all, prioritize them, define them, create rules around them, design, develop, test, and deploy. Mm-hmm. In an agile AI program, what we would do is we would just start with an apple and an orange, and define what are you trying to predict, or what is your classification model around this apple and orange. So you have an apple and an orange. So that means all of your data set of fruit will now be fed into your two variable model that will help you classify the incoming data. Is it an apple or is it an orange? You could also create a third category called other. And so at the end of that experiment or feature or hypothesis experiment or sprint, if you will, you'll have outcomes that give you feedback and results. And I think most data scientists and AI teams already operate this way. They create hypotheses and they create test experimental runs around their data. Doing it in an agile way means that you're not using the entire data set of available data variables. You're starting small. And what that does is that enables you to get information, feedback quicker so that you can sooner rather than later identify problems, biases, ethical issues, or other non-ethical issues. It's a best practice for AI development.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so you're trying to just get something out as quick as possible, or just iterate on something as quick as possible in this machine learning lifecycle. And I think that comes back to this question that we've been thrown around a lot in the community around the nature of machine learning and the nature of its its research side of things. And since it is so new, and when a company brings machine learning into their company, or they want to do things with AI and machine learning, it's not necessarily as straightforward as software development. And we talked about this quite a bit. Maybe we could try and recreate the spark that we had the other day on how you can define when something's done, how you can look at the, because machine learning is never going to be 100% accurate. And so does that mean that maybe these agile methods are not the best suited for machine learning? And this is, again, we've gone a little bit off the path of the idea of agile methods for AI ethics, but I think this is a good one to touch on since we're here.
Yeah, so from what I've seen, and again, based on the definition of agile, I think that many machine learning teams are operating in an agile format. They are creating these experiments. They are, creating test runs and developing and training their models to the point where they can gather feedback and use that feedback to iteratively either alter the data, alter the model, change some set of parameters, or et cetera. So I think that many of them, again, if we go back to the definition of agile, and it being based on a set of principles and values, I think AI lends itself naturally to being an agile machine learning ops environment. I think AI ethics, in AI ethics, we're looking at, so I think what we talked about the other day was how, while data scientists are taking an experiment and start with the premise that a model will ultimately never be 100% accurate, their goal is to get to a level of performance that's hopefully closer to 100%, 99.9 or whatever that threshold is. Ethics introduces the performance variables and other ethic levels of thresholds. And the challenge with AI ethics is that some of those ethical variables, there is the risk of imperfection, and there is zero tolerance for anything less than 100%. In some cases, there is tolerance for things less than 100%. So if you're creating a use case or a product, obviously like facial recognition technology as an example, and it's being used in one of the critical harm use cases for, let's say, that is in criminal justice or predictive policing. You want that product to be as close to 100% as possible. There's very little tolerance for less than 100%. In addition to that, an ethical practice is not only to have that user story dictate your threshold. So you would dictate or define and document your thresholds at that user story level, but then you would also prescribe perhaps another story or another requirement that says limitations of this product need to be properly documented and transparently identified to the consuming community. So if there are certain parameters in which they need to operate it, or usage requirements that say, a user should not rely upon this product solely or 100%.
So in those cases where it is very much high risk, I wonder about the point you were making earlier when you said that we can try to get that and maybe the minimal viable data, right? And try to use whatever we can to create a model and then get it out there. But I feel like those two ideas are working against each other, are they not? Like, you definitely don't want to have like the minimal viable data when you have such a high risk situation going on. Or am I mistaken?
Let me clarify that old example. So with the minimal valuable data exercise, you would start small. So in that exercise, you start with two products, an apple and an orange, and that's your first sprint. But you would continue your sprints until your backlog of all of the fruits of the world is exhausted. Of course, you would prioritize your backlog. Do you really need all of the fruits of the world? You would define that. So your ultimate product model, yes, it needs to be a complete model. It needs to address all of your requirements in a complete fashion. It's just, and perhaps that's why also I titled, today's discussion using the term balancing, because there's this sense of balancing, how far to 100% do we need to be to make a product ethical? And again, that really depends on the use case versus the types of needs of experimentation with a data science team. Another use case that we could look at is in hiring practices, and again, using facial recognition software as an example. So facial recognition software and facial analysis software, I think that's one of the conversations that I've seen as of late. We want that to be fairly accurate, although there are just some ethical discussions around, even if it's accurate, is it ethical for hiring decisions? If a person is smiling enough, if they have a disability, that could impact their facial expression in a facial recognition analysis tool. But one of the tenets that type of a use case would use would be whether or not the end product using facial analysis would then be coupled with other metrics, like whether or not the product resulted in more than 80% of a protected class being hired versus a non-protected or privileged class being hired. And so that is based on a 20/80 or a 4/5 rule that was defined by the EEOC. So in that case, if there are other decision support tools that are looking at 80% as a threshold, and I know that that's a little bit different because the facial recognition itself is the AI product here, not the decision support tool, but just to show that there are different metrics of fairness. And in this case, the EEOC is defining 80% as fair and not necessarily 100% parity as fair. So, it really depends on the use case and the type of ethical construct and ethical tenet that we're using.
Yeah, exactly. And going back to those user stories, again, like defining what is right and what is needed in that use case. And so we touched on the ideas of the AI audits or algorithm audits. There's a few different ways that AI ethics.
I wanted to share something else.
Yeah. Go for it.
Sorry. One thing.
Don't worry. I'll hold this thought. I won't forget it. I've got it written down. So
awesome. Once I get a thought, that's it. I think you mentioned sprints and how that can be a constraint also. And so one of the things that I've read is that, again, Agile itself is not a framework, but there are frameworks that are Agile. So Scrum is one, which is committed to roughly 2 to 4 week sprints. Kanban is another, and Kanban is not oriented around sprints. So if you have, let's say during your data phase, where you create your minimally viable data set, you create your proof of concept, and you're moving now into your pipeline phase. And in your pipeline, where you're actually adding on additional data variables, not just apples and oranges, but pears and bananas and everything else, you see that is typically taking a 3 to 6 week process, or a 3 to 8 week process. You can use a Kanban that prioritizes, that has a storyboard with that segments your phases into that segments your project into these machine learning operational phases. And each phase, you simply move in and out your stories based on the work that's done during that process. So you're not oriented or locked in, if you will, to a 2-week time-bound sprint. It's a continuous process. So there are ways of being agile in machine learning operations without necessarily using all of the Scrum practices.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that one. And I think that is something that people are really trying to figure out the best practices for right now. And if anyone out there in the chat is also on the same boat, let us know. But let's talk about this. You described 2 agile methods right there. And then we also have the AI ethics ways that ethics are coming into machine learning. For example, we mentioned the algorithm auditing before, and we also mentioned, I think you mentioned a few more. And so the merging of those 2 is really the interesting part, and making it so that it's not a fuss, right? Making it so that it is of a set framework or a set way of going about doing it. And I know that's something that you wanted to try to come up with. Do you have more ideas on that? We touched on a bit how we can kind of use the agile method with our AI style, but what other things do you feel like would help bridge the gap between those 2?
Bridge the gap between AI and AI ethics.
Sorry, no, between AI ethics and the agile, the Kanban boards you were talking about. And so you were mentioning the Kanban boards as something that, yeah, with ML and machine learning operations and sprints even, that's fairly common. And how do you see that with AI ethics and the different ways that ethics are creeping into the machine learning life cycles and the companies?
So the ethical tools themselves and the ethical techniques themselves become just another set, if you will, of checklists that data scientists at each of these sprint phases, or at each of these sprints within each of the operational phases, need to be aware of. So if their particular data set will require, is a high critical harm use case. Let's say it's a product that they're creating that will ultimately result in choosing whether or not an applicant gets into a certain high level of higher education, or access to capital, or access to lending, or access to housing. Sort of the traditional ways in which, as an example, ethical bias or data biases can creep into an AI process. The teams need to run through a checklist to make sure that they are looking for these, that once they've identified their product as a critical harm use case. And if it is, they need to run through a checklist to evaluate, to ensure that their data doesn't discriminate against protected classes, or any class, or any group of individuals or people. So the ethics become just another step, or another checklist, another mindset, another concern that occur within their operations. But within each sprint, it also depends on how they are defining a sprint. So if I've seen one person define a sprint as get the data. Then sprint 2, clean the data. Sprint 3, label the data. So in cleaning the data, ensuring that there are no bias or discrimination anomalies would be an important part of that process. And you would know to do that because higher in your design phase, you had identified your use cases that said, this is a critical harm potential product. I don't know if that answered your question. So it's not like, if we look at the types of ethical tools on the market, there are techniques and tools, explainable AI. I'm not going to say that I see, and maybe there are in the future, agile ways of doing XAI, or agile ways of doing interpretable AI, or agile ways of, including model sheets or model data sheets to your data sets so that your data is now explainable. These are just tasks, and they in themselves become additional tasks that are part of your stories or your agile practice.
If I understand that correctly, then it's not that you're trying to bring on the agile framework to the different pieces of ethics like explainability or the auditing. It's that you're bringing that into the agile framework that
Absolutely.
You're already, okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. We're bringing ethics, we're weaving ethics into the bedrock of existing machine learning practices. Can we audit an application in an agile way? I've been an auditor for many years. I haven't seen those two, concepts really overlap, but there are lean ways of doing most anything, starting small, taking the minimal, identifying something that's minimally viable. Agile promotes this concept of not waiting for the big bang until we have everything right to do things or to start. We need to start immediately, start small, get something done, look at it, get feedback from either an ethical governance board or some other, governance committee, and continue iteratively from there. Those are the principles that I see that are occurring within machine learning teams. They're not necessarily using strict Scrum, with daily stand-ups and velocity points, but they are beginning to toy around with stories and JIRAs and using traditional agile methods of structuring their process. One of the goals of using an agile framework is obviously, as I mentioned, to minimize your risk so that you can identify your risks sooner rather than later. Another is so that you have repeatable processes which make your teams much more efficient. And another concept in agile also is this concept of not only what you're doing, but who's doing it, your teams. So agile, has a lot of opinions around your team size, your team composition, your team length. Ideally, your team is self-forming. One of the things that I've heard other machine learning teams discuss is that often in a machine learning environment, your data scientist or someone used the term hippo, he who is paid the most money gets the largest voice in that team. Agile doesn't promote that or advocate for that. Agile advocates for a very flat, structured, politically structured team where all voices can be heard, everyone can give back feedback, and an ethical, an AI ethical look on team composition. I would throw in there is to ensure that your teams are widely diverse. So if you're using critical harm, or you have a product that's creating if that's potentially within this critical harm designation, ensure that you have members of your team that are racially diverse, that are gender diverse, and diverse across a variety of different criteria.
I agree 100% with that idea of having a diverse team. And what I question about it, though, is there's a significantly lower amount of diversity within the tech sphere, we can say, right? And so how can you really get a diverse team if you're not hiring someone who's just there to basically be the like token diverse person? Does that make sense? Like a Google or a Facebook, they can go and throw as much money as they want to pick up and get the best trained people from all over and make sure they're diverse. And so everything ticks the boxes. But you as a startup, you're trying to get this diverse team, but it's like slim pickings. How can we deal with that? And yeah, and so this is just something that I've been dealing with. I don't expect you to have an answer on it. And so we can move on though, because there is a question on in the chat, unless you wanted to comment on that.
In terms of diverse teams, I mean, you have to do the best that you can, but you have to make a concerted effort to do it. I saw one company where they, so there's this concept for model risk management, in the framework that I use, which leverages SR 11.7 or model risk management. One of the tenets or one of the activities that teams will create as a result of evaluating their model is a model grade. So not only do we, in the beginning of the process, we have model tiers where we're tiering the model, and that informs me of what types of activities I need to perform on the model. But at the end of the model process, once we've developed it and before deploying it, and prior to approving it, a model validation committee will evaluate the model and give it a grade, literally an A through F, or whatever nomenclature we want. And it's based on different criteria. And one criteria can and could be, the diversity of the team that supported or created or went into the model creation. So that you need to provide, so for larger companies, something like that baked in as a metric and as a performance metrics that would grade your model gives now everyone upstream in the life cycle, in the food chain, incentive to meet that metric. We need hard metrics if we're going to make a dent in diversity in any capacity, particularly in tech. But there are definitely ways that you can address diversity using diverse consulting firms, having an open competitive bid consulting practice, ensuring that you are aware of members of, let's say, of women business enterprise, Black-owned business enterprise, technology firms, and constantly, working with them to better understand their service offerings.
Mm-hmm. So this is something that I could go deep down the rabbit hole on, but I see some questions coming through in the chat, and it's great that people are starting to get excited and ask questions. So I want to go with a question first from SS, who was asking about using tools like Jira. And I know you mentioned this, and he or she, I'm not sure, is wondering if in Jira, what would epics look like if you are baking in the ethics? What would epics look like if you're baking in ethics? So like the collect data labeling, the data build the model, test the model, deploy the model, retrain the model, monitor the model. And how do you fit in this ethics part when you're using a certain tool like Jira? How have you seen that being used?
So in my opinion, so far, I would bake in ethics at the story level, not necessarily the epic level, although at the epic level, I want to understand initially, are you creating one of these critical harm use cases? Is this a product that can potentially impact lending choices, capital allocation, hiring choices, impacts to your employment, promotions, demotions, safety, predictive policing, criminal justice applications, privacy. So, any of those
Money's
things
involved.
that can obviously tip the scale. And there are benchmarks for that in charts. And if, they contact me, I can send them some information about that at a high level, identify what level of risk or ethical risk do we want to assign your project. And so because EPICs, EPICs are features or functions or sets of functions and tasks that we perform in Agile, but they typically are bigger chunks, and user stories are smaller, and then tasks are tiny, get the data, label the data. Although I know that actually in a data science capacity, that's not a small task. And data scientists have told me that they spend a lot of their time labeling and cleaning the data. So I understand that there's that difference from a traditional software package, but a software product lifecycle. But I would say that ethics are baked into your stories because you want very specific definitions, and you want to identify them at a very specific level. So in your stories, it's where you will unearth whether or not XAI versus any other tool is a better type of tool. It's at your story level that you will determine which variables are correlated for race or gender. It's at your story level or your minimally viable data level that you will identify and unearth these ethical types of questions.
Excellent.
I'm not sure if that answered or addressed their question.
That was great for me, but we'll see what SS has to say. And that makes a lot of sense. And shout out to everybody out there who is using Jira. I have a love-hate relationship with that tool. I've tried to use everything else, but you come back to Jira just because it has everything you need.
Right.
So
what do you use Jira? I've seen some other people using Trello for user storyboards. You use whatever is best. I do think Jira is the most popular.
Yeah, I think Jira is probably the most complete. I've tried to use Asana quite a bit, but it's, I use a little bit of each. And I know that engineers love Jira. Most engineer friends that I have, they're big advocates of Jira. So let's jump to this next question. How do you apply ethics to an ethically questionable domain like gambling?
How do you apply ethics to an ethically questionable domain? So, AI ethics, responsible AI for good, these have all been terms that are used synonymously, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Responsible AI is that body of knowledge and body of people in growing industry who are looking at or asking questions around, are we developing the right products for society? Are we developing products that could potentially harm society, independent of a given set of biases or privacy or safety or security concerns? If that product was operating correctly, 100% on all performance metrics, is it the right thing to do? Should we automate killer robots or weapons of mass destruction? Should we have AI that defines, those types of potentially harmful items to society? So gambling, I do think that we do have casinos, we do have legalized gambling. We do have, I was going to say Bitcoin, but it's another conversation. We do have,
another form of gambling.
Yeah, we do have legalized gambling. So I think that you can create an AI application for gambling that is legal and that thus becomes ethical in that in that in that construct. I mean, with everything, especially, now I'm putting on my Wall Street background, and I know that this has been a concern for some regulators around Bitcoin. There's this concept of an accredited investor. So they want to make sure that, markets are fair and safe for the investor. And so as long as there are hopefully controls that ensure that that gamblers are using, or users or customers are using this tool with full on, that they are adults, they are above the age of 18, that they have 100% consent, that their privacy, their data, their money is safe, secure. I think that those are the types of questions you ask at the product design level, up front, in the business model.
So I think we've saved the best for last. This is another one from the chat, and it's from Brendan, who is asking, this is a great question. It's a little bit long, but amazing nonetheless. Agile advocates rapid iteration of the product, supported by automating as much as possible to know we haven't regressed. There was mention of a checklist of considerations which suggests that maybe at least some of the ethical considerations can be automated. Do you think it's possible or even desirable to automate any of the ethical considerations in this way?
So I think that it's possible to create tools. I think that it's possible to learn. I think that it's possible to learn in each of your sprints and during each of your project processes. And at the end of each sprint, Agile recommends a retrospective where you review, like you would in any normal project, what worked, what didn't work, and what practices do we want to take forward. And so as you continue on in your sprints, not only from an MVD or minimally viable data or minimally viable model perspective, but continue on project to project now. Once you've created that product, you move on to product number 2. Product number 2 is probably going to leverage components, teams, knowledge, intelligence that you've learned, and models and data that you use in product number 1. So as you continue in your journey of creating machine learning, it is possible that the exercise you went through to clean your data, let's say, and let's just focus on one area like privacy or gender bias in your data. If you've gone ahead and you know that there's certain independent variables that are correlated to each other, your next project, you already know that. So if you get a new set of data, then whatever you did to identify or tag those correlated independent variables, or to clean and ensure that your data is not heavily weighted or biased against one protected class, you can now automate that in the next in your next project. I do think those possibilities are there. I do think, however, that to have a robust and comprehensive and assured ethical program, it's important that the organization, not even necessarily the machine learning data science team, the technical team, but the organization needs to have an ethical board. And that ethical board needs to include an ethics officer or an AI ethicist. Mm-hmm. It should include members of the team, of the technical team, and other people who span the organization. And here I'm just thinking of the larger organizations that I've been a part of. So that product, as we manage the product and as we manage the broader program, products sit within a project and those sit within a broader program. we are evaluating the types of ethical risks, and we create a risk register of those risks, and we understand where those risks sit for each product and project. So it's a balance of both. I don't think we're at 100% automation at all. I think that there are some techniques that can be automated and learned and sent over or learned from project to project. But I think that you need people who are looking at this deliberately. Yeah. And that's why I think that ethics needs to be embedded at user stories, at your minimally viable data, at your minimally viable models, during your model testing, and at your team composition.
I think it reminds me a lot of what Shay said when I spoke with him, Shay Brown, and one of the first questions I asked him was, hey, do you think there's ever going to be a point in time when we can automate this algorithm auditing? Because I had seen that Amazon, I believe, they came out with an automation for auditing your algorithm. And so his answer was great because he said, well, it still feels like we're trying to figure this out. We're very new. And until we know exactly how and what to audit, it's not going to be doable by machines because we're still figuring it out as humans. And so the machines obviously can't do it because we don't have the process. We don't have what to train them, what to tell them to do yet. So that is a very interesting one.
I agree with that. I mean, in terms of automating, so, there is robotic process automation, and you can automate specific tasks and, at a detailed data level, whether you're labeling these two variables or cleaning these two data elements or evaluating correlation amongst data variables for gender bias. I think that at a task level, some things can be automated. I think that now, but that's at a specific task of development and design, not auditing. Auditing is at the end of the process. So there's scoping, identifying data, training, model, testing, deployment, and then auditing. Auditing, in my opinion, and from my perspective, needs to include the entire life cycle, not only from the technology activities, but also your governance activities. Do you have policies and procedures? Do you have model tiers? What is your governance board and your governance structure? As an auditor, I would look at not only your algorithms, but your entire ethical program. Can that be automated? No. I would flatly say no. But I will say, and what I do agree with Shay on is, and I agree mostly a lot of things that he says, is that this industry is nascent and growing. And so in software technology, we have the concept of CMM, capability maturity model. So capability maturity model simply says, software processes and tools and techniques and people are evolving. We are evolving in a staggered step, and it's a model, a maturity model that starts from level 0 or level 1 through level 5. Level 0, you have total chaos. You have no processes. Everyone's doing whatever they want. Level 1, you have some processes, some sense of cohesion. Level 2, you have repeatable standard processes. Level 3, you have a very well workable system. And level 4, you have nirvana, or level 5 or 4, whatever it is, you have nirvana. And at the highest level of nirvana or bliss, you actually at that point don't even, having written a documented policies and procedures is secondary, because the procedures, the process steps are in your head. The ultimate goal of an organizational culture that is to have that culture reside within the individual, so that the individual represents the culture and can repeat that process, making it much more efficient. And I think that AI as an industry is not at level 5. AI itself may be level 2, maybe. AI ethics, we're kind of level 0. We, some of us, dress nice and we look like we want to be a level 1, but we're kind of level 0 to level 1. AI agile, level 0, so there is an evolution, and there are stage gates and things that distinguish when you move from one to the other.
Brilliant. Well, Pamela, it looks like we have officially run out of time. I want to thank everyone who is still with us and for asking all of these incredible questions. Thank you so much. We are in the MLOps Slack. If you want to come join us, I'm dropping a link to that. So you can come in, say hi, ask questions about MLOps or ethics. And yeah, let's keep this conversation going. Thank you again,
thank you
Pamela.
So much. If anyone wants to contact me, I'm looking at holding another event like this in the future. My website is jasperconsulting.ai. And I also just want to say that, as we talked about Jira, there could be the potential opportunity for other tools that leverage specifically agile concepts and agile ethical concepts within machine learning tools.
Perfect. Well, that's all we got for today. Thank you again, and we'll see you later.
Yes, thanks everyone. Nice having you. Thank you.